Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in about 1 minute.
What happened?
Alrighty, good afternoon. I'm Angela Johnson. A few quick logistics before we get started. If everyone can turn their cameras off and their audio so that we can just have the speakers for the remaining of the session until the last 15 minutes when we will open it up for questions. All right, a few more folks are joining and we will get started. Okay, well, thank you for registering to attend Politics Remixed with Jovan and Mayor Taylor. I'm the founder and co-CEO of Coalition of Black Excellence, where our mission is to unify and elevate the Black community. So we're an all-volunteer run 501c3 nonprofit organization, and I'm so excited to get going with one of our new virtual series, Politics Remixed, where we will be focusing on providing members of the Black community access to thought leaders and resources that help them understand the political process and their rights. So to learn more about our past events or upcoming events, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Experience CBE, or visit our website at cbenonprofit.org. As I mentioned, this session will be recorded and available on the website. Again, please keep your camera off for the remaining of the session until the last 15 minutes, where I'll come back on and invite questions from the audience. And with that, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jovan. So Jovan, our host for this evening, he has nearly 20 years of community relations, government affairs, legislative affairs, political and public relations experience. He's helped to advance and introduce hundreds of bills and committee hearings and is a highly sought after strategic advisor with Savvy Consulting, a strategic public affairs and government relations practice that he started over a decade ago. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jovan.
Oh, thank you, Angela. I got to take you with me everywhere I go. You're a great hype person. So I appreciate the introduction. And I just appreciate, the opportunity to continue to engage with your vision and people like Kevin and others who had the vision for what we now know as Coalition of Black Excellence. It's desperately needed, I think, at this moment in time. And so I'm just excited for it. Thank you for having me. I look forward to future endeavors together. So as was stated, I'm going to try not to repeat anything that was said, but I'm going to try to humanize everything that was said. And so for me, my background is I've been in the government affairs space, as Angela mentioned, for almost 20 years. I am a native of California. I grew up in Fresno, California, more specifically West Fresno, which if any of you are familiar is one of the poorest census tracts in the country. And so growing up, I've always was raised in a family where we understood very keenly the need to give back. The more you gain, the more opportunity and expectation there is to help others. And so I continue to allow for that to govern my life. I've been very fortunate to help prominent individuals and organizations achieve their goals. I've been very fortunate as well, as Angela has said, to run my own consulting business for the past 2 years. I'm very passionate about helping the next generation of leaders, particularly African-American leaders, better understand how to serve in government. Then also very passionate about real estate development. How do we ensure that community revitalization reflects building of people, then also building of the physical environment? And so those are two areas I'm extremely passionate about. And I just love the title of this session, Politics Remix. Hip hop has had a tremendous impact on my life. Oftentimes in my head, it serves as the remix for what I'm doing in terms of music playing in my head. And I just love the fact that it's authentically ours as a people. It's truly American. It truly speaks to a group and a community of people who took things that were throwaways, leftovers, that the establishment truly didn't care about, and it repurposed it. And it made it something beautiful, something marketable, and something that's in high demand. So when you think about what hip hop is and the word remix, I think it's very fitting that we talk about politics remix, because I think we're living in an era where we can't do politics as usual. We're going to have to make it our own. We're going to have to put a twist on it and tailor it to meet our needs. And so that name says it all in terms of what our charge is and what we hope you get out of this conversation today, which is one of many. I'm very pleased that for our first segment, we have Mayor Taylor out of Menlo Park, who I think serves as a reference point to the type of individuals that we want to help get elected to office. But not only do we want to just help get them elected to office, we want to make sure that we're giving them the support they need to navigate the walls of city halls, state capitals, and federal capitals to help make policy decisions that better serve our community. And so with that, I'm going to pause and then let Mayor Taylor introduce herself and talk a little bit about her background before we continue with the remaining of the conversation. So Mayor Taylor.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I have some challenges with connectivity, so if I freeze, I will continue to speak. I am so grateful to be here on multiple levels. One is I appreciate the work that CVE is doing. Is definitely needed. And also just listening to Jovan, this is our third conversation, and each time I hear you speak, I want to listen to you more. The work and your vision is definitely needed. And then also just wanting to learn a little bit more about your expertise. But for myself, my name is Cecilia Taylor. I was elected to the Menlo Park City Council in 2018. I was then selected as being mayor pro tem by my council, and now I am serving as the selected mayor. The first time that I ran for office was in 2016. My intention was then, it wasn't necessarily to get elected, but it was to demonstrate why people should challenge our incumbents. If I hadn't, they would have just walked right back to their seats. From that time, even though I lost, I still stayed active in the community because it was very important. If you run for office and you lose, that doesn't mean that you lost the battle. It's just that you need to regroup, continue your work, and run again if you choose. If not, at least mentor someone else to run, because it's very important for, I guess I'm considered to be the average person as opposed to being someone who is wealthy or came from a background that automatically led to this leadership role of being a political leader. So I look at what my position was a little bit differently than the average person that would run for office. It was more around being an inspiration to the community. And fortunately, I was elected with that inspiration in 2018. My background before I got into politics was actually in teaching. My passion was in early childhood education. From those 25 years of experience, I believe that I have great classroom management skills, which has led me to being able to conduct myself in a way as an elected official that commands not only respect, but also to make sure that everyone's voice is being heard in that space. The other piece that I would like to share with you is that my family was also politically active over the years. I'm the fourth generation in the Bay Area, third generation, as my mother corrected me this morning, in Menlo Park specifically. My great-grandmother actually worked for Mr. Stanford, bought a home in Palo Alto on a street where it was designated that was the only street that Black people can buy homes. And so moving forward, my grandfather bought his home in Menlo Park, was also active politically. He and my grandmother helped with the Rumsfeld Act, and also my grandfather helped start the NAACP chapter in East Palo Alto. Moving forward, my mother, she was elected to the Ravenswood School Board in the 70s and is also very active today. And so for me, it is a part of my birthright and my responsibility to be active politically in some way. I had no idea I would be an elected official in 2020. Here I am bringing my best to the table. And I appreciate having a platform to talk about not just what I am doing, but talk about what we can do moving forward.
That is an awesome, quick peek into your background. And Kevin Coleman, who is a leader of CVE, he and I talk a lot about how our ancestors orchestrate a lot of where we are today. And I think the background that you just shared is a true testament to that. We have a lot of people who are in our families and who were relatives of us, whether by blood or not, who lived, sweat, and died to allow for us to actually play what I like to call inside baseball, to do exactly what you're doing. You know, a generation, 2, 3 ago, oftentimes in many of the cities that we now represent could have never imagined to be a mayor of a city like Menlo Park. So it's amazing to see what can happen over the course of just really 1 century. And so that's awesome. Can you speak a little bit more? Would you be comfortable maybe speaking a little bit more about the activism, and was there any sort of spiritual reference, or what was the energy like? Because again, I think the purpose of today's call and the goal of today's call is really to do a couple of things. One, I think to humanize you. You know, oftentimes people see a name, they read a bio, they look at a website, and they think they know, but they don't really know. So I think it's important that we humanize our leaders so that we can better relate to them and they can relate to us. And then second, make sure the audience is aware of what your policy priorities are, and then get into a little bit of conversation of your vision for the future, and then how folks, if interested, can get involved to help you, which ultimately helps them. And so before we get into all that, I would like to maybe unpack your background a little bit, because there's just a lot of things you said that have been fascinating. And I had to refrain myself when you talked about your experiences being a teacher and classroom management, because I'm sure, you know, in the capacity that you serve, sometimes it feels like your peers aren't necessarily probably adults. And so I'm sure that, you know, a lot of those skills are becoming very handy, you know, every Tuesday for your council meetings. And so with that, I would like to speak a little bit more about, you know, like I said, you know, was there any spiritual presence in your home? You know, sort of what was the you know, spiritual laws or natural laws that kind of govern, you know, your family? Because oftentimes that's the X factor in all of this, right? We can go get the fancy degrees, we can be articulate, you know, we can be well packaged, but it's those things that we don't see that oftentimes undergirds us and allows for us to do exactly what you're doing. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I can. And I believe it's actually the opposite for me. Growing up, this wasn't the conversation growing up. Growing up was more about, for me, it was more about survival and what was happening in my household at that time, and then also in the city of Menlo Park. And so the piece around my family's leadership, actually, I didn't learn enough about it until I was an adult. And so as a youth, it was more about what I saw, what I experienced, whether it was with a neighbor or with my teacher. It was more about what my experience was in the moment. I grew up mainly needing to have survival skills on a daily basis. I decided to be an adult far too young. And so my rebellion has led me to where I am today. It has been more about me saying, no, I'm not going to accept the direction that you tell me to go on. It was me trying to create my own direction. And then later finding out that a lot of that rebellion came from my bloodline, even though I wasn't aware of it. So I didn't become aware of my family's history until I became an adult, really, and started paying attention. I was too busy, younger, hanging out with my friends and trying to figure out my own path, as opposed to taking my history, my family history, and using that to build my path. That came later on.
That's awesome. So talk a little bit about your transition from being someone who was young, rebellious, you know, tried to, you know, maybe behave in a manner that preceded your years. Talk about how you went from being that person to being someone who became maybe a little bit more conscious about the need to help others. And then what did that transition look like in terms of maybe some of your nonprofit work or work in other organizations? So what did that transition look like for maybe your teen years, late teens, early 20s into kind of more what I call philanthropic work?
The change came when I realized that I wanted to go into teaching. So maybe around 16, 17 years old, I decided I wanted to go into the field of teaching, and I knew that that would not happen unless I had some piece of paper that said I was qualified. So that meant making sure that I went to school. I got a degree, I got a certificate in early childhood education, and then decided I wanted to go further. So it was from experiencing working in that field with our 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, deciding that I wanted to have more of a leadership role, not just in their lives, not just in the children in my family's lives, but also in order to move forward, you have to prove that you are educated in that area and also experienced. So I had the experience and no education. So decided to move from getting the early childhood education certificate into getting a bachelor's degree. I initially went to San Francisco State to become a teacher. So I was going into liberal studies. Once I saw what liberal studies required you to do, I thought it was too much of a common sense degree and needed to be challenged a little bit more. Had no idea that my challenge was going to lead me to mathematics, which was extremely hard, but definitely worth it. Because along the way, I ended up meeting students while I was a tutor that talked about their experiences in math and why they were afraid of it or why they didn't do well in it. And it's just the way we present information to our children or to adults even so, as to why they react the way that they do. So all of these pieces as I went on led me to wanting to continue into a leadership role, because teaching is a leadership role. And so it just kept evolving as I learned more about not just what I wanted to do, but also experiences other people were having. And then I also was a key piece in at least in my sister's life, as far as helping her with her children, with their challenges, whether they had needed childcare or whether they needed tutoring. I just made myself available. And each time I would have experiences with my own family, it made me want to actually be a better person, figure out ways to be a better leader, figure out ways where I can do it on a larger scale. And so from there, it was, at that time, I didn't say this earlier, but at that time I was actually living in Daly City and also kind of back and forth between San Francisco while I was at State. When I decided to move back to Menlo Park in 2015, bringing all of what I learned back home with me and then seeing what hadn't happened since I left. And so for me, not enough change had been made. The same reasons why I left were still relevant. And so for me, there needs to be access to some exposure of not just the same everyday thing. There needs to be access to high quality jobs. There needs to be access to high quality education. There needs to be access to some type of health and wellness. I didn't see enough of that, and so decided to get involved in 2015. And so from there, it was running and then losing and then starting the nonprofit Belhaven Action because the works needed to continue. So my candidacy wasn't just about the needs of the Belhaven community or the needs of Menlo Park as a whole. There were other pieces that needed to be dealt with. There also needed to be a place where people can be mentored into a leadership role. And so Belhaven Action, it wasn't just me. There were two other people that were involved, and then helping to encourage them to be a part of that leadership team, because it wasn't just about me. That was the piece that I had to keep working towards everyone else to see, that it was about all of us. And so how could I pull people in? And my motto in 2016 was, how can I be most effective? And then also, how can I encourage other people in my community, my family, my friends, to be politically engaged, to be civically engaged. There is a structure, at least in the city of Menlo Park, it's called an organizational chart. At the top are residents. Underneath the residents, they elect the city officials. Right next to the city officials are the advisory groups. Underneath the city officials, we hire the city manager, and the city manager hires everyone else. I say that almost on a daily basis to remind people of how much power our residents do have, even though it feels like you don't. But the fact is, the residents are in charge of government. And so we need to figure out ways to mentor leadership, to remind and empower our community members that the residents are in charge of our government. And so for me, that's a daily task. And so going back to, and I tried to look at policy, because you brought up humanizing the role, also policy, and then how to move forward. So the policy piece, right now for me, I see that—
So Mayor Taylor, before we get into that, before we transition into the policy piece, so you said a lot in terms of your background that is extremely meaty. I'm over here taking notes, writing away, and we don't have enough time to unpack all of it. But I want to touch on a few things you stated, because I think all great leaders are able to do some of the things you said. And there's subtleties, right, in leadership that I think oftentimes people don't pay attention to. And it's those subtleties, it's those small things that differentiates being where you want to be versus desiring to be somewhere and just not quite being able to get there. And so you had mentioned, when you were doing tutoring, you had talked about you saw sort of, I'll call it systematic issues. You didn't, but you talked about the way we present information, right? That was your exact quote. And what I found is that people that are able to play leadership roles are able to be in the exact same places and be looking at the exact same thing, but see it differently than everyone else. And it's that person's job to almost become an interpreter and a translator for the others, which by default almost makes you a leader. And the reason why I wanted to point that out, because one, it speaks to a leadership quality, and two, you hit the nail on the head in terms of the exact same problem we're dealing with in politics. People are looking at it, but not quite sure how to navigate it to extract out of it what they desire. And so the same way you've applied your skills to tutoring for math, you're being prepared essentially for what you're doing now. So I wanted to touch on that. The other thing you touched on, which I feel that people who also rise to the occasion in terms of leadership in a season, is this notion of what I like to call push and pull. And so you talked about, growing up in Menlo Park and all these things happening and how all these things became a push at what point in your life. They were the things that you wanted to get away from, have nothing, right? I'm saying these words, you didn't, but I call those push factors. But then a few years later, nothing changed according to your account, but you were pulled back into them. So what that means is that you were just being prepared, right? And so I want to highlight these things because so often we shy away from fights or we shy away from systems or people because those things don't change, right? But really for us, if we are true leaders, which I believe, everyone in CBE for the most part is a leader. And it's about how do leaders become much more effective in their space. It's how do we understand our role in these things and not looking to these things to necessarily change, but looking at ourselves and assessing where we at in terms of our preparedness to go back into these spaces and really do what in many instances we were purposed to do. And so I just wanted to highlight those things because they were very powerful that you said. I think the other thing that was very powerful as well, you talked about your 2015 run for office and then you subsequently losing. I think that's important to highlight as well, because oftentimes people look at, our past and our trajectories and they just think it's, success after success after success after success. And so I just wanted to highlight that without spending too much time on it, because I think that's critical as well to talk about then what set the stage, for you ultimately winning office in 2018 and then doing what you were doing, to this day. And so with that, I do want to transition and talking a little bit about, your current priorities. What are some of the policies that, you're kind of doing deep dives into? And then, what are some of the challenges with doing that? And so you were talking about policy.
Yes, just speaking on policy, and thank you, Jovan, because I hadn't looked at the push and pull, but at any rate, thank you. Thinking in terms of policy, just recently, there was a Black Lives Matter resolution that myself and Councilmember Nash pushed forward with the City Council, which was actually adopted on June 18th of this year. And essentially the policy says that we will look at reform policing in Menlo Park so everyone can live their lives without fear, reform our land use policies to reflect one united city, prioritize climate action and empower the city's environmental leadership, ensure the city's services support all of our residents and everyone feels welcome, revise city policies and practices to promote inclusion and equity. And so with that, it was adopted on June 18, 2020. And my intention, even months before this, is that when we pass any resolution in the city of Menlo Park, there needs to be an action item behind it. It's not a proclamation to say, yay, you did a good job. No, it is a a resolution that needs action, because these items on the list are impacting people's lives. Specifically, each one of these items are affecting our Black community in some way and have been. And so what we need to be doing now is figuring out how do we move forward with those items and take action. And so the next list of priorities that Councilmember Nash and I put forward was about how to do it. So what are the action items that we need? When we talk about police reform, for me, it was about if we were cutting in all areas of the city, it wasn't just the police department, how do we reimagine how to offer public safety services in the city? So if we only have $15 million, but we used to have $18 million, how do we provide that service, the same service that we were spending $18 million for, with $15 million? So that was one of the intentions of that, at least for me. The other piece was looking at what is happening between the police department and our residents that possibly needs to change. And then how do you even start that without having a conversation? And so that's what started, and this was actually, I think it was June 18th, or maybe the 6th, 17th, where we had actually a town hall with the community. And then prior, we had a town hall with the police chief. So that was one item. The other is land use. So we know I'm not sure how many people know, in San Mateo County, and specifically Menlo Park, our land use policies have included redlining, blockbusting. And so we know that, and it's only happened in one area in the city of Menlo Park, which is the Bellhaven neighborhood. So what are we doing now to actually change that? Recently, I want to say a few years ago, only affordable housing was being put in the Bellhaven neighborhood. It should be spread out throughout the city, considering that our neighborhood is a part of a school district that is historically been underperforming. And so, but that is common in a lot of Black communities where the affordable housing is in areas that are tied to communities that are in districts that are low performing. And so how do we change that? If we keep doing the same thing over and over again, we'll still get the same response. And so that was another piece to that resolution. But another part of it is that in 2016, the City Council adopted a new general plan. In that general plan, only upzoned areas around the Bellhaven community, which means that all of the development was happening over here, at least related to the general plan. And so a concern of mine and Councilmember Nash is that if we're overdeveloping a community before we even provide the community what it needs to be sustainable. And so that's an issue. Whenever we have any type of land use, we're updating it, it should prioritize the existing community's needs, period. And so that didn't happen. And so our goal is to get those needs to be a priority. And so it's actually pretty challenging. It was on our agenda on Tuesday. And unfortunately, I was taken ill on Tuesday and we weren't able to complete that meeting in order to have that discussion. So I was actually hoping to have a great update for you today. But unfortunately, we're still in the same place. Fortunately, we're in the same place. Unfortunately, we haven't moved forward yet. But hopefully that will be on the agenda coming up. And I know I've said a lot, Jovan, and I can ramble on. So if there's something specific you want me to discuss, I can do that, or I can keep rambling on. It's up to you.
Yeah, no, there's a few things I want to hit on, but in terms of the resolution, some of the difficulties that you're having to advance that, what I want to do is try to unpack it a little bit for those who may be listening, who may not truly understand, all the components that go into what you're trying to do. So, one, I think you alluded to, council meetings are on Tuesdays for the city of Menlo Park. What time are those council meetings typically?
Typically they're at 7 o'clock, but because of the shelter in place order, we've been starting our meetings at 5, and they're all teleconference meetings.
So with that, oftentimes there's a lot of pre-work that goes into the presentations that occur for council. So when mayor talks about, a resolution and then all the aspects of the resolution and then it being heard on a Tuesday, oftentimes there's weeks and months worth of work that precede that action happening. And there's what I like to refer to as jockeying. So on any issue, you have two sides, at best, maybe three, where you have people that are supportive, you have people that are opposed, and you have people that are anywhere in between, undecided. But what's also happening, and those oftentimes are your elected. So the city council, from my understanding, has 5 members for the city of Menlo Park.
Yes.
5. So you have the mayor, and then you have 4 other council members. I think it's also important to note that the charter for the city of Menlo is not a strong mayor city, which means that you have a strong city manager that runs the executive functions of the city. And so that's important to highlight as well. So what that does now is it actually further complicates the priorities that Mayor Taylor wants to advance. So for example, in cities where you have strong mayor like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Fresno, that I mentioned earlier, the mayor is the elected officer as well as the chief executive officer. And so that means that that mayor has the abilities to not only set priorities based off of what they feel they're hearing from their constituents in the city, but they also have the ability to control the budget and staff resources needed to advance those policies through direct order. If you are not a strong mayor, essentially you have to have a heightened sense of political will. You almost have to force it through motivation or coercion or a strong urging to pressure those city officials or the city staff to advance some of the things that the electeds are promoting. So the reason why I say that's challenging, because now what you have is you not only have the mayor who, talked a little bit about her trajectory into her seat, which isn't one where everyone had, wide open welcomed arms to receive her. So she's already in many instances fighting a mindset and fellow council members who aren't necessarily receptive of some of the things she's doing. So that's one level of fight. You then have staff who are staff of theirs, who it's their full-time job to manage some of these policies and, organize people to come out in opposition and push back against her. But then you also have city staff that serves over the budgets and that serves in various departments that are actually working full-time to either help or hurt or discourage these type of efforts. And so when Mayor talks about, at a high level, some of the, delays or slowdowns or things that can cause discouragements, and oftentimes tries to incentivize people just giving up, it's all these things at play. And so, part of it is wanting to kind of just slow down and talk a little bit about that. So if you'd be willing to kind of pull back the veil just a little bit more to really talk about all the facets that are involved in really kind of bringing this to the agenda and then hopefully, carrying it through the finish line.
Thank you. And you just explained it, my life since December 2018. There's pushback, at least I've experienced pushback if it isn't something that the staff has already vetted, to say that this is something we're comfortable doing, so we can move forward on it. But if it's an idea that's completely led by myself, it makes it even more challenging even to bring it to the table. And I don't even use this term, not to beat a dead horse, but myself and Councilmember Nash were the 2 council members that brought a moratorium to the table last year. And it appeared that we may get some support, but essentially it was more of, I felt like we were sabotaged before it even came to the table. And that's because the idea of a moratorium meant that we would slow down or halt development until we figured out what did we miss when it came to residents' needs. My goals will always go to residents' needs. And I appreciate our businesses, I appreciate our developers. However, my goal is to focus on residents' needs. And so because this wasn't about the developer and the businesses, it was about residents' needs, I feel that it was sabotaged from the beginning because that wasn't the priority. And so now when we bring things forward, and I say we, because if I try to do things independently, I probably will always fail. And so having support from at least one other council member from the beginning to figure out, well, what's the best way to get to the end result? What's the best way to prioritize our residents' needs? What's the best way to find out what our residents want to see from our city? And so doing it with someone, I believe, is a good way to start. And then figuring out, well, once we start that discussion, okay, what policies do we want to put in place that could actually get to that goal? And then it's pulling in a discussion with either the city manager or the city attorney to find out legally what's possible and legally what's not possible. And then it's putting together our own message, which is what the Black Lives Matter resolution is, and then bringing that to the council and getting support. And so one thing that was on our agenda this past Tuesday are actually policies that make it more difficult for the council to even bring items to the agenda. And considering that we're the policymakers, it should actually be the opposite. And so the challenge is it depends on who's bringing the item to the table, and then what is the item about. And so it's a difficult place to be in. However, the public sentiment for me is the priority. So if we keep bringing it to the public and the public wants it, it makes it harder for the city staff, or even other council members to say no. The public is asking for you to address a problem. And if we're not doing it, what are we doing there? And so I just look at how we can move forward.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what always amazes me with a lot of these instances where there's these battles to do what is right by the people, there's this common theme of holding electeds and staff true to their city's charters or constitutions, right?
Right.
I mean, if you think about it, you know, when you think about the fights of, you know, the 60s of King and X, I mean, literally it was just telling America to honor its own constitution.
Right.
Right. And that's a lot of what you're talking about when you laid out kind of the hierarchy of order for your city and command for your city. You know, you're just saying that based off of our own constitution and charter, the community is at the top. The community is our bosses. And even if your city charter or constitution didn't say that, the US Constitution says that, because we decided to create a democracy. And so once we made the decision to create a democracy, that automatically made the people in some capacity, you know, the boss, or to hold electeds accountable. And so I think that's a constant ongoing battle to do. But with that, I think that we're really now at the crux of why these conversations are important, right? Because many on this call are involving themselves with these discussions, involving themselves with Coalition for Black Excellence, because they want to be more connected for the purposes of betterment. You know, whatever that means, whether that means employment opportunities, whether that means scaling their businesses. And I think one of the things that we have to realize as Black people is that just as government was highly instrumental in our plight to sort of not be all that we should have been because of policies and politics, it's government that can actually do the same thing to change that course. And so one of the things I think we have to do a better job of as a community to help our leaders is to become engaged with the process and to help educate people like yourself in terms of what are some of the policies we would like to see in terms of helping with city employment, for instance, right? People sometimes don't even realize that that city manager for the city of Menlo is probably making, you know, $200,000 a year plus. You know, the city attorney is probably somewhere in the same ballpark. And, you know, city staff, district directors, chief of staff for some of the council members, you know, these are anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 a year positions, you know, in most cities. And so, you know, those are opportunities for what I like to think of as wealth creation. And I think when we're sort of reigniting and re-emerging this conversation of Black power in the 21st century, it has to look a little bit different than it did in the mid 20th century, right? Where it was very heavy about voting rights and all those things. Those things are fights we need to fight, but we have to understand the 21st century in a country like America that is first and foremost capitalistic. Money is a tremendous form of power. And the more wealth we have, the more powerful by default we become once we know how to organize it. And we must not bypass the role of government in helping us to attain and retain that wealth. And so I think when we talk about resolutions like you're passing, we have to immediately begin to talk about, what can we do to send a signal to those that are trying to stop what you're doing, because they're sending a very clear signal. They're sending a signal that you're not welcomed here. And what we'll do is we'll just drag this out because you'll be up for election and again, in, probably 2 years, and hopefully we can take you out and then, this thing will go on to bed and we don't have to worry about it anymore. That's what they calculate. That's what they factor in, those who do not want to see initiatives like this move forward. So I would like, for us, before the conclusion of this call, to talk a little bit about, what can we do in a very simple way to send a message to, the council, just to say, hey, we're paying attention, we're watching, because that in and of itself are the type of communications we need to have. We can no longer wait till something like this fails, or for someone like you to be out of office to then become reactionary and try to gain back what we should have been a better steward of when we had it. And so I just kind of want to interject that a little bit to kind of, again, connect the dots in terms of why we're here today. So with that, I want to be sensitive of time. What are the next steps in terms of process? Are we anticipating that this resolution goes back next Tuesday? Is there not yet a date set? Can you kind of talk a little bit about the process?
Well, at this time, there hasn't been a date set. It's been continued. We do have a council meeting on September 15th and also on September 22nd. So it's possible that it will be on the agenda for one of those dates. And I think the biggest obstacle that we have is community outreach, community voice, and then also community access. Our area, District 1 in Menlo Park, which is the Bellhaven neighborhood, the Life Science District, and also Haven Avenue, has the least amount of access to resources to connect with the council in this capacity. So as a teleconference call, we're less likely to be the ones calling and listening or participating in a council meeting now because of access to the internet, or because of access to a tool that you can use to access the internet to call into a meeting. And also this idea of, is it my responsibility to make sure that all the somewhere around 7,000 people in my district have information about each and every council meeting? And I put it on myself and say yes, even though I don't have the capacity for it. But there's this level of outreach that isn't happening so that people have access to the information. And when they do, they participate. So I think and I can't remember what your question was specifically, was if it was call to action or next steps. For me, the next step is making sure that everyone in District 1 has information about the council meeting, and it doesn't have to be all 17 topics that are on the agenda. It could be just 3. And these are the 3 items that you need to pay attention to. And these are the 3 items that you need to have input on. And that needs to happen all the time, every time we have a meeting. And that's not happening.
No, and that's a perfect segue. And what I'm going to do is connect a little bit to vision for the future, because we're moving into getting on the verge of our Q&A session. But again, I think that we can't afford not to get involved in these kind of engagements, because one, and I'm going to open it up, I think it's important that whether or not you live in that district or whether or not you even live in Menlo Park, I think it becomes very important to let electeds know that you're paying attention, because we cannot forget that many of these electeds have aspirations for higher office. So just because they may be a colleague now of Mayor Taylor, many of them are looking to go up to state assembly, state senate. And so, if we allow for them to get away with this sort of stuff at a local level, they'll run for office at the state assembly, state senate, and come back and say that they were our community's best friend, right? And we'll never know what some of the votes and actions they took at lower levels of government. And so, I'm going to encourage that we think about and we talk a little bit about, before we conclude this call, what is maybe just one thing that we could do collectively to weigh in? Because if we're looking at going after some of the bigger, what I like to call bigger fishes, right? Contracting opportunities with the city. If we can't win these sorts of battles with low-hanging fruit policies like resolutions, What do we think it's going to be like when we're trying to get a $250,000, $500,000, $1 million contract with the city of Menlo Park to provide a service? When we're trying to disrupt the relationship that many of them have had with vendors for years, it won't happen. And it won't happen because they know we have no muscle. They know we're not paying attention, or they know that when we show up to the fight, we're going to show up with a book when they show up with knives and guns. So we have to not only be aware of the process, know when it's happening, we have to be knowledgeable and girded up on how to engage when we do. And so that is part of the purpose of these conversations, as much as it is, you know, getting the substance and learning more about our electives. And so with that, you know, the vision is definitely for us to move an agenda around economic advancements as well as some of the social policies, because they go hand in hand. We cannot fool ourselves to think that educational outcomes for Black people will get better if they go to poor households. Health outcomes will get better for Black people if they can't purchase healthy food. And so we have to do a better job of connecting the dots as a community to elevate the conversation around economic empowerment because of its connectivity to social outcomes. If we as a community become so socially focused, where we talk about inclusion and equity around social issues and leave out the economic piece, we don't do ourselves a service, because it's not enough to put a Black child in a high performing school if that Black child goes sleeps on the street at night, or if they go sleep on in a motel that night. It's not enough just to put them in a state-of-the-art classroom with a high performing teacher. Their academic outcomes won't change much. It's not enough to put a clinic in a poor community that has some of the best doctors if that kid is going without meals 2-3 days a week. And we want to see their cognitive skills improve. It won't happen. And so we have to understand the correlation between economic empower and economic improvement as a means to changing our social outcomes. And it's government's job, in my opinion, because government has created this reality that we see, whether it's for those of us whose ancestors were part of the slave trade, or it's those of us who, after slavery, we were doing our self-determination thing through Reconstruction. We had more African Americans in elected office than we have at any point in history that actually had an agenda. And then because of it, they introduced Jim Crow to block it and to set us back. And they started manipulating the Constitution and diluting our votes to the 3/5 compromise. Government has created a lot of the realities that we know today. And their focus was diluting our political power and our social power because of the economic power that we were growing. And so we have to understand what the root causes were that they were trying to undermine and unravel, and figure out how do we start there so that we can rebuild a community and communities that are focused on advancing the conversations and changing the plights that we know today. And so with that, I don't want to dominate too much of the conversation. I would love to transition it, Angela, to you. But before I do, is there a lasting thought, Mayor, that you want to leave that wasn't touched on before we transition to Q&A?
There are a few, and thank you. And first and foremost, since it's 2020, let's all be counted. Let our community be counted. And second is make sure that we're all registered to vote and that we all actually vote.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So Angela, I'm going to turn over for you for Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So now is the opportunity. If anyone has questions, you can just turn on your camera and I'll unmute you. We do have one that was submitted via chat that I'll just read for Jovan and Mayor Taylor. What is the best way to advocate for communities that face the daily challenge of disparities that result from lack of policy, especially when those communities affected most feel unseen and unheard? So I'll say one more time, what's the best way to advocate for communities that face the daily challenge of disparities that result from lack of policy, especially when those communities affected most feel unseen and unheard?
Mayor Taylor, want to take a stab at it before I jump in?
Yes, and I'm waiting for it to hear what you have to say. But one thing that comes to mind for me is with creating a policy, and Jovan, I know you're going to have a lot of great input on this, is creating a policy that does the opposite. So you're no longer unseen, you're no longer unheard. It's just like the outreach. We don't have a policy that says that the city has to do extra outreach in areas that are unseen and unheard. Creating policy and enforcing it. It's something that you have to force, because what I'm experiencing is that no one wants to do anything extra. That's something that I have to do, or a community-based organization has to do. But for me, that's city responsibility. And Jovan?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And before I actually go into what I was going to say, I'm going to unpack what Mayor just said a little bit. In terms of being unseen and unheard, I don't know if we can even fully appreciate how unseen and unheard we truly are. And so I'll just give an example of that. What most people do in elected office is they have consultants or people that pay attention to voter data. And there are systems that are used that are tracking people and their behaviors to figure out how to communicate to them during election season for marketing and various things. There's algorithms created for everything. So in politics, there's a database known as Political Data Inc. There's another one known as VAN, Voting Action Network. And these are some of your premier databases that a campaign consultant will use to begin to map out a political strategy. I'm bringing this up because African Americans, Blacks, in Political Data Inc. cannot be earmarked. They can't be targeted. One of the reasons is because of Proposition 209 back in 1996. Ward Connolly, Pete Wilson got rid of affirmative action, which not only said that we can create preferences in various aspects of government activity, from education to contracting to a whole host of areas, but the true killer is that we can't even be earmarked. So the data can't even be captured. So the first injury was the fact that preferences couldn't be created so that proportionally, at least we would get opportunities at some of these economic policies. But the other is that the tracking had to go away. So now, 20 plus years later, we don't even know what the true outcomes and the devastation has been because of these policies. And so we have an opportunity this year with Proposition 16, where we're going to look at reversing some of that. So I would encourage all of you to vote yes on Prop 16. This is not about favoritism, but at a minimum, it at least puts us back in a position to know what is happening as it relates to our government and its interaction with communities of color and women. We do not have that now. And so I would encourage you to do that. But the other is going back to Political Data Inc., is that the way you can identify a quote unquote Black voter in California or nationally is through deduction. So what you do is you say, okay, I want to run a campaign. Let's say it's Mayor Taylor's campaign, and I want to target African-American voters in Menlo Park. What I have to do is I have to deduce by surname. So I have to say, okay, well, Gomez is probably Latino, Yang is probably Asian. And so through deduction, who's ever left over, we assume is African-American. So what happens is let's take Sacramento, city of Sacramento, for instance, county of Sacramento. There are, 100 or so thousand African-Americans. African-American likely voters are about 20,000 in the database. So that means when we are trying to target African-Americans, at best, we have 20% of the data we need to even communicate to Black people. So when you talk about being unseen and unheard, we don't even know the half of it. But the other half is, what can we do until we can change those things? And that's organize. What we have to do a better job of is in spaces where we congregate, keeping our own data, and then better understanding how do we organize and deploy that data in a very focused way. We can't be dissipated. We can't be all over the place in terms of our priorities. It's not saying we forego our priorities, but we have to become laser focused on what are we channeling our energy into. So perfect example is the Black church. That's one of the few bastions we have left in our community. And unfortunately, our community is no longer zip code. Our community is really around issue interests, which is why a CBE comes together, because it's very economically focused. So our community here is one, not where we all live in the same neighborhood or on the same block. It's where we have a consolidated and a centralized interest. That's our community. So we have to coalesce our data, and we have to become very focused and say, in 2021, what are the one or two things we are going to do? And then what are the strategies and tactics we have to employ to do them? Once you do that, you don't have to worry about being seen. You won't be able to be ignored because you'll just be showing up. You'll just be running your race. And when you run your race and you run it well enough, just like in sports, the scouts will come looking for you to give you a scholarship because they'll want you to be a part of your team. So what happens then is those same groups that want to oppose you, The next strategy will be to try to pick you off and divide you, because you will become so powerful, they'll try to pay off your leaders, they'll try to hire them to do all these things because they'll want to separate the leadership from the masses. That's when the true test will be in terms of standing together and staying focused on the vision and employing your strategies and tactics. So one is becoming organized and bringing in direction for these already organized groups like churches, motorcycle clubs, the CVEs, and making sure we have a very focused agenda annually, and then talking about what are the things we have to do to see it through for that year.
Great, thank you. We have another question. What actions and programs, Mayor Taylor, are you using to bridge the gap between the Bellhaven neighborhood residents, primarily Black, and residents from other parts of Menlo Park?
Well, as far as programs, the city of Menlo Park has their own public facilities that are open well, not open at this moment, but normally are open. The services are now being offered online, the virtual activities. And so that's open to any resident in Menlo Park. As far as a specific activity to connect the Black community to the rest of the city, supposedly it's already done. But honestly, you can't see that because there's still this element of not feeling welcome. A part of the Black Lives Resolution reflects on making sure that all residents feel welcome throughout the city. And so there has to be an intention, but until the city actually faces that there's an issue, because they don't think that it is still. This is, racism is in our head. It's not actually a problem for some people. And so it's still something that has to be challenged on a regular basis. So there isn't a specific program, but the Black Lives Matter resolution does touch on that.
Great, and this next question is related and a perfect one to end on because it looks like we're almost at time. When we talk about engaging in the political process, we often hear things like vote, register for the census. While I agree that is important, what would you say is the next level or step for someone interested in engaging more in the process in your district, and some of the resources and tools you can point us to?
Well, honestly, I'm the resource. At the moment, there are a few organizations that are encouraging leadership, especially from women, but they're specific to Menlo Park. It would have to come from someone like myself, mentoring, and someone like yourself asking to be mentored, and then setting some clear guidelines on what does that look like. If, for instance, I decided I was not running in 2022, I would love for somebody to come up to me tomorrow and say, hey, I'm interested in running. Would you help me? And for me, that's where it starts. There has to be some level of interest. Somebody has to decide that they're going to be that candidate. They're going to be that caveat that is going to help move our community forward. There has to be participation, and it can't just be one. And two is great, 10, 50, 100 or more. If I was able to get almost 80% of the vote in my community, then I would think that at least 20% of the community would be available to help me move things forward, or should I say help us move things forward. So it really comes down to participation.
Yep, absolutely.
And I'm just going to add one quick thing on there.
Yep.
And again, I think it gets to the economic piece. And so one of the things that I've created is a political action committee called Impact California. I would encourage you, maybe Angela, you can send it out to the group, but it's impaccalifornia.org. And that was specifically because this is the fourth PAC that I've been a part of building. The three others were for prominent organizations and prominent individuals who wanted to increase their own political power. So they hired me to help them build PACs. I've done this one. It's my legacy project. It's building a PAC for our community, because what we can't forget is the money side of politics. So when Mayor Taylor rattled off all those interest groups that would like to see her not be successful, those are some deep-pocketed constituents. And so when she runs again, what they're gonna do is, just like they're organizing right now to try to stop an initiative, they're gonna organize their money to try to ensure she doesn't get reelected or make it very difficult for her to do so. So we as a community have to play that game as well. We do the voter registration stuff relatively well. At least we talk about it. At least we talk about the importance of it. But we have to start playing the money game better. And for many of us, we can't write a $25,000 check or $50,000 check or do a $100,000 independent expenditure. But what we can do is contribute $25 a month, $50 a month, $100 a month to organize something that has $1 million or $2 million in it, so that when these fights are taken to the mayor, she has a well to draw from. She has people that not only can come out and volunteer, but that can write her campaign checks so that she can hire the expertise she needs to do her job successfully and to save her seat. So I would encourage you all to take a look at Impact California. I would encourage you all to support. Again, it's just a legacy project for me. I don't make any money off of the endeavor. It's something that I'm volunteering my time to do, my own intellectual capital to it, for us to have a pact to advance our community's issues.
Great, and we are at time. Thank you so much, Jovan and Mayor Taylor. This was super educational and informative session. So for everyone, again, if you missed any portion of it, the recording will be available at cbenonprofit.org. And thank you for joining us today for our first series of Politics Remixed. Thanks.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.
All right, Mayor, see you later. Angela.
Bye. Have a good day.